Okay, welcome back. This video is going to work alongside two diagrams in our company law module. One is the diagram on share issue up here, and the other is the worksheet on issuing shares. Now, the first thing to look at is the share issue diagram so we get an overview of the law in it. What we're going to be working through in the Companies Act is under Part 6, we have issue of shares, section 43(2) through to 51. We don't look at all those sections. Now, the first thing about issuing of shares under section 42, which is where we tend to start with this, is subject to the Act and Constitution. The board may issue shares at any time to any person, any number it thinks fit. Now, you do want to consider this in terms of your assignment. Do you want to limit this power under the Constitution? Because if you don't, the board can simply issue as many shares as they like, and they can issue it and therefore create new shareholders with voting rights, which would dilute or reduce the percentage of votes that existing shareholders have. That would simply mean that a shareholder who's a minority shareholder with 20% and a company with 100 shares, if they issue 100 shares to a new shareholder, that person now has 10%, halving their rights to dividend and halving their voting power. Now, theoretically, bringing in the new shareholders should increase the value of the company and mean that the value of that shareholder's investment, the 20%, when it becomes 10%, is actually worth more money. However, give some thought to whether you should limit the board's power to simply issue new shares. Now, if we go through to the diagram, you can see that under share issue, we need to decide who we're issuing the shares to. Are we going to give them different classes, rights? Are we going to do things to protect existing shareholders? For example, if they're going to be a minority shareholder after the new share issue, should we give them rights to appoint directors so that they can't be forced off the board of directors? So first thing we do is say, are there limits in the Constitution? So let's assume under section 42 we did put a restriction in the Constitution saying no new shareholders, with no new share issues without unanimous consent of existing shareholders. If we did that, we have a limit, so we go down this side. If we didn't, then the directors can just issue the shares. Now, if there's a limit in the Constitution, that means we have two options. We might actually just change the Constitution. That means going back to section 32, which we discussed, and getting a special resolution to change it, and now the rule's gone. And from here on, the directors can issue shares as they wish. Or you may make up a new rule. The other option is to give a one-off approval, just for this single issue of new shares. You allow it. After this, it goes back to the normal rule, which means they have to come back to shareholders each and every time, which is a good protection, but it does limit the ability of the directors to issue new shares. And if you did make it unanimous, that would mean, say, a 10% shareholder would very much control the company's ability to raise capital through new shares. Let's have a look at section 44. So 44, shareholder approval for issue of shares, and it's quite straightforward. If shares cannot be issued by reason of any limitation or restriction in the company's constitution, which is our example, then the board may issue shares if it obtains approval for the issue in the same manner as approval for an alteration. In other words, a special resolution. So we go through that process, and now we can issue shares. And we may have made up new rules, or we may just have allowed it to happen. Now, once we've got through those issues, we have to follow up to a procedure that's necessary for issuing shares. And the first one is section 45, preemptive rights. Now, these are different preemptive rights to those we discussed in shareholders' rights, where we talk about section 39 and transfer. That's between the company and its existing shareholders. So in that example, we simply had the company sitting at the top. We need that a little smaller. And we had A, B, and C. And the issue of can they go sell to somebody else is section 39. So that was between these people and potentially between a third party, another person you might bring in. Now this is where we have new shares. So we are now talking about issuing new shares, and this might be to person E. Now this is where a different type of preemption comes in, and that's section 45. And what it really says is we must offer to A, B, and C first. So they get first right to buy the new shares, whereas in our previous preemptive rights example, that was to buy shares off existing shareholders first. And it's very, very similar. Section 45 is simply saying offer them to the existing shareholders first, and you offer them in a proportion of existing rights. Right, so in that example, if that person had 50%, 25, 25, and that's the current 100, and we have a new 100 being offered, then clearly they've got to be offered 50, 25, and 25. So when everything's finished, the balance of shares as a ratio is exactly the same, 2 to 1 to 1, 2 to 1 to 1. Now we're getting that from section 45, and you can see the wording. Shares issued or proposed to be issued by a company that would rank equal or to voting or distribution rights, just jump over there for the second, must be offered for acquisition to the holders of the shares already issued in a manner that would maintain the existing voting or distribution rights. Now what's important to note here is the Constitution may negate, limit, or modify the requirements. So you have to decide, do we want this arrangement? Maybe we just want E because they are another company that would work well with our business, provide us with cheaper materials, or give us access to markets, like combining with a distributor or supplier. So we want them for good commercial reasons, not just for money. But if we have section 45 preemptive rights, first we got to go through here, and if they don't, then we can go over here and give the shares to them. But if they take them, we can't now offer them here. So you may want to think, should we have section 45 in, or in our Constitution, should we take it out? As with all of this, there is no right answer. It's a commercial decision as to what you see necessary in your company. So in your assignment, consider the two options and just make a decision. Okay, now, once we've decided we're going to issue shares and we've followed through with preemption, the really important area is valuation. So we're going to have to value those shares. Now, if we go back to the Companies Act and we look at the contents here, we've got issues of consideration for issue of shares. Now I'm just going to start with 46A to make a point, and that is saying a shareholder is not liable to pay any consideration for shares under section 41A, which is when you start, unless the Constitution specifies a consideration to be paid. So when we form a company, the company is actually worth nothing. So we'll just get rid of all of this for a second. It's not wanting to play games, is it? Now, if you think about it, when we have a company first formed, what's its value? So we have A, B, and C. Now, what we've really done is we've gone to the company's office and we've spent about $165 to form a company. What are its assets on formation? The answer is nothing. Therefore, the value is nothing. Now, therefore, if you think through this, the shareholders should probably pay nothing. But one of the aims of forming the company may be to raise initial capital. So you may say there's 100 shares and there'll be $1 in cash. Now, if you write $1 in cash, it means cash. It doesn't mean supplying some form of goods or intellectual property and claiming a set-off. That is fraught with problems, which we could discuss in class. If you say cash, it means cash. If you want it to be goods, put down some goods and be very, very specific. Now, one of the things that's important to understand here is at the start it's worth nothing, And our company's law recognizes this. And what it says about shares, which we jumped over in the previous session, but I'll just mention now, is no nominal value. What it says is a share must not have a nominal or par value. A nominal or par value is where we form a company and we arbitrarily say in our constitution we have 1,000 $1 shares, or any number you like. We're not saying the shareholders will pay that money, we're saying we are giving this company a nominated capital value. This is very common in a lot of countries where we have par values, which means we issue shares at par, and if we issue them at $1.50, we'd have a premium, and we have premium accounts. So if you are familiar with those systems, you need to put them out of your mind for New Zealand law. Now, going back to our Companies Act and our sections here, this valuation comes in section 46, and we have to determine the consideration, and it must be cash, promissory notes, contracts, anything we'll do as consideration. So we can issue shares in exchange for money. It could be for a future services contract, it could be for intellectual property, it could be for a truck or a bulldozer or a digger. It doesn't really matter as long as it's real consideration. Consideration being payment. Now, the main thing to focus on here is valuation. If you issue new shares, you must value them. And the value that you give must be determined as a reasonable present cash value. We won't go into the accounting issues of that. And it must be fair and reasonable to the company and all existing shareholders. Now, what that means is if we have a share issue, for some reason that's not playing very well. So if we have our company sitting up here, and we're going and we value the company at say $150,000, and we use whatever acceptable valuation method there is. It could be EVA, it could be net asset value, lots of them we could discuss. And we have 100 shares. Then, being very simplistic, they're worth $1.50 each. So if we're going to issue a further 100 shares, then we must get the equivalent back of $150. Now, if I actually do the maths properly, that wouldn't be that, would it? It would be $1,500. It should be 150,000, wasn't it? Because we're doubling it. I'm a lawyer, not a mathematician. So all this says is if the company is worth this much, we say what are the shares worth, and we must be getting equivalent value back. If we offered shares worth 10%, then we need to say we're getting consideration back, which is worth $15,000. Okay, so the theory here is very simple. To be fair, what you give away, you must get back the equivalent of, and you need to go through a valuation process. Now, just to finish our diagram off, we can then issue the shares, get the money in. We do have the issue of if we change the constitution, this may activate buyout rights we discussed earlier. But for right now, the share issue process is to follow that diagram through in that way. And in the next video, we'll just turn back to the worksheet and just follow that through.